Greetings, good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Greetings to everyone who's joining us. My name is Ismail Lawyer. I'm director of the Islamic Religious Freedom Institute. I'm joined here by my colleague Jeremy Barker. He will introduce himself momentarily. Um, Today we have the fourth in our series of webinars um, from the Religious Freedom Institute on Islam and the state. And today we're really blessed to be speaking with a scholar of Islam, a very learned scholar who Jeremy will introduce. And this point of the series and the purpose of the series is to explore the relationship between Islam and modernity, and as a manifestation of modernity is the nation state. And today our topic is really going to focus on the crux of the matter. Our previous webinars have dealt with various foundational questions such as what is modernity, what is secularism, what is nationalism, what is the nation state, and we've in previous webinars discussed the relationship between Islam and the state in certain contexts, such as the Ottoman Empire, such as in Bosnia. And today we're going to take a more theoretical view, to step back and look and see what, whether or not, and to what extent, modernity and Islam are compatible, and to what extent the nation state does or does not negate certain key aspects of Islam. And so, Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and introduce our guest?
Great. Yeah, everyone, as Ismail mentioned, I'm Jeremy Barker, and I direct the Middle East Action Team here at the Religious Freedom Institute, and privileged to be co-hosting this series with Ismail. Joining us today, as always, from Sarajevo is Osman Softic, a friend and colleague on a number of projects. So Osman, glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Great to be here. And then, as Ismail mentioned, our featured guest today is Imam Dr. Khalil Abdul Rashid from Harvard University, the full-time Muslim chaplain at the university, as well as a lecturer at the Kennedy School and the chair of the Board of Religious Life at Harvard, and a fantastic scholar of Islam. And so we're really privileged to have him on. And so let me bring him on. Yes, Professor Khalil, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeremy, and salam, and to Osman and Ismail as well. It's a pleasure and a privilege.
So all of us have been kind of discussing a recent paper you did for the Yaqeen Institute on the waqf system that touches on a number of these issues. But as Ismail said, we're really looking at some foundational questions. So maybe, Ismail, do you want to start our conversation with an opening framing question for Professor Khalil to get us going?
Sure. Dr. Khalil, I think that I'm going to throw to you the widest possible question here, and hopefully you can elaborate on this. So the question really I have is, to what extent our modernity and modern nation state, to what extent are they compatible with Islam? There's been a lot of discussion and a lot of focus on this in the academic world, as well as in among Islamic scholars and people in general. This transformation of from the old order to the current order, with the dominance of the state, the disappearance of mediating institutions between the rulers and the people, the elimination of institutions like the waqf and the shariah that was administered by ulema, the elimination of the millet system. All of these and the creation of the citizen model. All of these transformations are drastically different from the pre-modern order, not only in the Islamic world, but also in the world in general. So because
The elimination.
so because so much of our Islamic statecraft and work on that was related to that pre-modern context, now there doesn't seem to be much relevance when we go back to those previous times, like the writers like Mawardi and Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun and so on. We seem to be in new territory, and it seems that modern Islamic scholars, contemporary Islamic scholars, don't have very much to offer in the way of trying to explain how we relate these Islamic institutions to contemporary times. There just doesn't seem to be a connection. People like Mufti Taqi Uthmani, people like Yusuf Qaradawi, people like Abdullah bin Bayya all have different sort of visions for that. And yet somehow, in my personal opinion, these all seem to be somewhat unsatisfying. So I'd like to ask your opinion just to share your expertise with us on this broad subject, and really anything you can say about that will be really enlightening and fascinating to us and our listeners.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair. It's a huge question and a very, very important question, I think, to think deeply about. And, the issue of whether or not Islam is compatible with the modern nation state requires an understanding of not only Islam and not only the modern nation state, but where the fault lines exist and where they both meet. And this requires a very good understanding of the nature of Islamic history and the contemporary world. So you have, for example, folks like Professor Wael Halak, for example, and who talks about the incompatibility of the state, the modern nation state system with Islam, because of what in his opinion, the project of the modern nation state and what it's trying to do, and its basis, its foundation, European Enlightenment, versus the project of the Shariah and what it's trying to accomplish vis-a-vis the kind of citizen, the kind of individual. You have other folks that take a more modernist or more centrist approach in looking at a few concepts of governance within Islamic law, and then trying to Islamize those concepts, right? And this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, this goes back to Tahtawi and Rashid Rida and many scholars in Egypt who were thinking about this back in the 19th century, to modern scholars of today. I think about this a bit differently, and I think we have to understand that not only the difference between, if we put aside the discussion, the academic discussion about what a state is for a second, and just use the term state as a simple reference point about governance, right? A model for governing, right? Let's just keep it simple for now. We know that there are technical definitions about what a state is and how that differs from what an empire is, etc. Put those things aside for now. Let's just talk about governance and governance structure and authority. What we find is something quite interesting, right? Is that the Islamic world, if you were to take sort of a graph and a map and map out the trajectory of the Islamic world from, let's say, the Umayyads up until the Ottomans, right? Let's say from the 7th century or from the 8th century up until the 19th century. What you would find is a very interesting trajectory. You would find first and foremost that in the first of all, even going back to the Prophet's era, there were two major establishments where governance occurred, right? One was the mosque, which had multi-functions, right? The Prophet's mosque in Medina functioned not only as a prayer space, it also functioned as a kind of public square, in the sense that public meetings took place there, entertainment took place there, and I'm recalling incidences during the Eid celebrations where there was entertainment in the mosque, for example, like the way a parade might be today in the middle of a city. When there were political delegations to visit the Prophet, they met in the mosque. Today, if you were to go to the Prophet's mosque, there's still a pole there that's actually labeled the pole where delegates met with the Prophets. The label is still there in the Prophet's mosque. Most people don't notice it, but it's still there today. I mean, we know specifically where people sat, where political leaders, tribal leaders coming into Medina sat to visit the Prophet. It was peace and blessings be upon him. So the mosque was one institution. It was like the Capitol building. It was like the public square. It was also a prayer space. It was a place for adjudication. That was one space. The other space, interestingly enough, was the marketplace. Right? So the marketplace in Medina was where all the economic activity was. It was where the entrepreneurial activity was. It was where the development of a business class, a bourgeoisie class. We don't like the word bourgeoisie, but that's exactly what we mean. A merchant business class that was in reality separate from the political class, what we would call the state apparatus. Right now, as a side note, but also a very interesting note, the Prophet in his times, peace and blessings be upon him, put folks in charge of both. And so when he was gone, for example, we know Bilal was in charge of the mosque. We know Abdullah ibn Maktoum, the blind man, was essentially head of Medina, served as governor of Medina in the time of the Prophet. When the Prophet left, there was a person with a disability who was in charge of the state. And the Prophet also put a woman, her name was Ashifa Abdullah, in charge of the marketplace. So this is a woman who the Prophet appointed as governor of the marketplace, in charge of inspecting the market. All contracts went through her office, etc. Right. So appointed the first woman secretary of the treasury, if we would call it today. Right. Those two institutions, the mosque, which had a multi-purpose institution function, and the marketplace, came into the Islamic governance system, but then had very different trajectories. In the mid 8th to 11th century, I'm going to really fast forward Islamic history, but this is very critical to understanding the answer to the question. From the mid 8th to 11th century, we had what we would call today separation of powers. So you had the executive running the office, you had the judicial, the scholars, the ulema, that were separate from the political establishment, separate from the state. But at the same time, and you had the market, the merchants, the business class that were separate from the state. The economic activity occurred separate from the state. The legal, philosophical, intellectual, educational activity occurred separate from the state. And then you had the state bureaucratic apparatus that was independent of both as well. However, you did have patronage during this time, the Abbasid time. You had the production of intellectual minds. You had the patronage of education. That's why you had the growth and development of philosophy, of monuments and architecture and art and pottery, all kinds of designs and discoveries, and the sciences and medicine. And that's when the book that's out today, 1001 Inventions, chronicles that period in Islam. After the 11th century, you have you had a trajectory that contributes to the challenges we see today. So from the 11th century, the Muslim world took a turn in the direction that set up a long-term cultural, philosophical, and political foundation that we are struggling to get rid of today or to change today. And that direction, which is very important for us to understand, is three things. Number one, a hierarchical system, a social hierarchical system, which we still have today, where individuals at the executive, the sultan, folks in the palace, they're at the top of the hierarchy. They're at the top of the pyramid. Underneath them is the military class. Okay, the military class. Underneath them is the scholarly class, and underneath them is everybody else, and underneath everybody else are merchants in the business class. This is very important. This is a hierarchical pyramid that was discovered by the Seljuks in the 7th century, but was not Islamic in its roots, nor was it any Seljuki in its roots either, but was from the old Sasanian Empire, from the Persian Empire, the way they did governance. Their governance model, the Persian Sasanian governance model, was imported into the Seljuk dynasty, which then became exported to the Mamluks, became exported to the Ottomans, became exported to the Safavids empire. And a hierarchical social system developed in the Muslim world that we are struggling to get rid of today, where at the top you have the ruling class, and underneath them you have the military, right, which we see vestiges of this today in many Muslim nations as part of the state. And part of the military connected to that class is the scholarly class, i.e. the ulema state alliance. And then under that is everybody else. And then underneath everybody else at the bottom is the entrepreneurial merchant class, right? The idea that a merchant class, an independent, separate merchant class, is a threat to the political establishment. That hierarchical model, which became known in classical Islamic teachings as the Deen and Dawla model, that became enshrined, so to speak, in the Seljuk way of operating, in their royal operation, way society was structured. It became exported to the Ottomans, the Mamluks before the Ottomans. So it became part of the social structure, hierarchies between in the family, hierarchies in the society, etc. This is the first thing that became part of the establishment of the imperial trajectory of Islam, of Muslim empires, that's having an effect on us today regarding modern statehood and the compatibility issue. Can we decouple our notion of hierarchy, particularly the idea that the military class is above an intellectual scholarly class, and particularly with the degradation and the lack of emphasis of cultivating and developing an independent, separate business class, so that commerce, finance, banking, investment, and economic infrastructure occurs separate of a state policy, where you have actually free individual markets that grow and develop, etc. This is the first piece of the puzzle. Second piece is this idea of an Ottoman, an ulema and state alliance. The idea that scholars were allied with the state, and therefore, because you had state and scholarly alliance, although we know in the Islamic literature, the legal literature is full of warnings against this, right? Full of warnings against scholars showing up at the doorsteps, of the rulers. In practice, however, there was strong ulema state alliances, all through Islamic history, and even till today, right? And that had its roots in the ever dominating atmosphere of sectarian divisions, right? The sectarian divisions which had plagued the Muslim world from the time of the Fatimid dynasty, the time of the Abbasids having two caliphs at the time that there was a Fatimid Shia caliph as well, and the desire to want to strengthen Sunni orthodoxy against the threat of a rising Shia imperial dominance. This alliance was there was an alliance that was needed to be created between the Sunni ruling elites, the ruling authority, political authority, and the ulema state, in order to enforce what would be orthodoxy in the educational madrasas, for example, to teach and define what was orthodoxy vis-a-vis what was heretical teachings against, for example, against the Shia. So you had imperial projects to bring ulema into the fold under the auspices, under the fold of the palace, under the auspices of trying to create orthodoxy, to galvanize the people against this threat. But and what happened was, in some cases, in many cases, certain ulema began to be paid by the palace, endorsed by the palace. Revenue streams to become shared between the military and madrasas. So you had imperial madrasas. You had scholarly positions that were paid, which led to very lucrative posts as judges in the empire that were sent across to different places, etc. So because of the ulema-state alliance, which occurred post the Seljuks dynasty after the 11th century, 12th century, also there was at the same time, remember, globally there was the Crusades at this period as well. And so there was not only an internal battle between what was Islamic, what was not Islamic, there was also an external battle between the Muslim Empire and the invading Christian armies. And so there was a real desire for an alliance between the scholarly class, which was attached to the public, and the ruling class, which wanted to be seen as legitimate in their desire to defend Islam vis-a-vis foreign invaders, for example, right? So the ulema-state alliance, point being, was created on both sides of, right, in the Sunni imperial Islamic history and in the Shia imperial Islamic history. And this set the foundation for very long-term precedence, which was very problematic, which struck at the very core of the separation of powers. Because once you are co-opted, once intellectual and educational, pedagogical apparatus is co-opted by the state, you're in the name of orthodoxy, right? Then at that point, education ceases to be academic. At that point, education ceases to be truly intellectual and becomes, you become the parrot that simply parrots precedents. And intellectual activity stagnates in the name of national security, in the name of public stability, etc., right? And so while at the legal level, Islamic law developed in a very robust manner, it was because Islamic law was patronaged by a desire to further crystallize orthodoxy and to further align proper thinking to stabilize the empire and to stabilize the community, as opposed to thinking for the sake of thought and the reproduction or the production of intellectual dynamism to allow for creativity, for industrial ingenuity in all segments of life, right? So intellectual creativity occurred in the legal realm, but there was a stagnation in other realms, for example, in other intellectual realms, right? Which continues till today in many places. If you look at the academic educational numbers and statistics for even literacy in many parts of the Muslim world, let alone educational levels, it's very poor. It's very poor. Which brings me to the third and final point that is necessary to understand. Connected with all of this is the third pillar. And the third pillar was the decision that was made through the ulema state alliance post Seljuk, right? In the Seljuk time, but really right after the Seljuk dynasty. In other words, 12th century forward. The decision that was made to that as part of the Muslim social, intellectual, and cultural fabric that defined orthodoxy. Sufism would be considered normative and proper, whereas philosophy would be relegated to the margins, right? So the practice of Sufism, which began to be fashioned by tariqas, Sufi orders, began to be very popularized. It even began to be welcomed in different parts of the palace. Every scholar had to be part of a Sufi tariqa, a Sufi order. In the empire, it was something that was normative and exceptional and fine. But philosophy was not, right? Philosophy was regulated. And Sufism became the philosophy. The language of Sufism became the intellectual tool that was used. So if you wanted to talk about the mind, you had to talk about the heart, right? And it was the search for not only a purified soul, but it was a search for a hidden knowledge that was based in more introspection. That was not a threat to the ruling class. That was not because people weren't engaged in rethinking about their society, in rethinking about norms, about new norms as it relates to politics and economics. People were thinking about the self, their own self. They weren't thinking about the society. So, but when you think philosophically and abstractly, then you start to think about the way you live. You start to think about the norms around you. Writings such as Ibn Tufail's work in Andalus, his Hay Ibn Yaqzan, where he talks about in his writings, the danger of institutionalized religion. What happens when deen or religion becomes institutionalized? The institutionalization of education, the institutionalization of everything. That's what Ibn Tufail wrote about. Ibn Khaldun, for example, writes about the dangers of not just the dangers of political and royal office, but the fact that they will decline. The dangers of a harsh taxation policy and the pride for the need to develop a strong business class, a merchant class that's allowed the freedom to do what they want in the marketplace, to earn extra income so that the standard of living of everyone rises. Those kinds of works were not part of the central teachings in the madrasas where everyone had access to information. On the contrary, everyone was routed in the direction of spiritual cultivation, which is important, which is proper, which is part of the Islamic tradition, no doubt. But the thing is that Sufism at that time was also hierarchical. It also involved allegiance and dedication, giving up the self to the hands of a particular sheikh who was very hierarchical. And Sufi tariqas in that time were known and authorized by the authorities. And so it was another way to exert control over the population, control over different groups. Institutions emerged around Sufi orders, for example. We know even the military in the Ottoman Empire adopted the Bektashi order. The Naqshbandi Sufi order became associated with the palace, as well as many elites in the city. So Sufism became a normative practice that was part of bringing in members of society into a controlled environment that engaged the public, but also was hierarchical and authoritative and controlling as well. Nonetheless, had a function, it was part and parcel of our deen, but it was also instrumental in controlling the population. Nowadays, for example, we have a very different take on Sufi orders with modern Muslim states. But the vestiges of these three things, vestige, of hierarchical social society, the vestige of an ulema-state alliance, right? And with the hierarchical society is the co-opting of the military, the prioritization of the military, right? A militarized state, right? So the militarized state, the hierarchical state, the ulema-state alliance, and the favoring of a society that is more engaged in self-revolution as opposed to societal revolution and intellectual revolution. Those are the three vestiges of Islamic history that we are dealing with today. Therefore, my dear brother Ismail, all of this culminates in your question about compatibility. Is Islam today, can Muslims today deal with, if you think about the question of revolution, the issue of the Arab Spring comes up, right? And so the idea of personal revolutionizing the self is no longer a major issue when you think about it at the societal level across societies. People are constantly thinking about their governments, their economic conditions, what's going on. They're looking at other states and other places that have revolutions, civil war, right? This is the first thing. The second thing is the ulema state alliance. Do we see indications of this today? Absolutely. Even in states where there is a secular constitution, right, and in states where there's a democratic constitution, regardless, we still see vestiges of an ulema state alliance, right? And third is the hierarchical issue. Can Muslim modern states today deal with the issue of hierarchy in the face of a growing call for equality? If those three issues are dealt with, then compatibility is solved, in my view.
Okay, thank you very much for that really, really valuable survey of history and concepts. So I wanted to follow up on that. We have or at least I have an impression of pre-modern Islamic history where, and no doubt it's idealized and, somewhat, idealistic. But we have this picture of the ulema as being mostly, or at least relative to today, mostly independent, notwithstanding some periods of more or less, co-option. But we don't see, we don't imagine, or we don't see we don't look at history, the historical situation as being like what it is today, where ulema are actually mostly either employees of the state or in prison, or marginalized, or marginalized somehow. We think of al-Waqf, the waqf system, as sort of financing an independent system. We think of the judiciary that was administered by the ulema as being somehow separate from the siyasa of the ulema. And we also, notwithstanding the hierarchical structure that you mentioned, we also think of we also look to periods of and notwithstanding the institutionalization that you mentioned, where there's manipulation and there's, let's say, like a pushing in a certain direction by the state of the ulema's thought, we nevertheless see massive dynamism and productivity and vibrancy and creativity from the ulema, and that seems to sort of peter out in the early modern period. The last gasp of Islamic scholarship being people like Ibn Abidin or Ibn Ashur or Alusi or people like that, and then after that it seems it seems to just sort of peter out. I mean, there's really no one like those people today. So even notwithstanding the history that you mentioned, and then we have like the codification in the Tanzimat, we associate, or at least I associate, the modern period with the Tanzimat reforms, and then the successor states of the Ottoman Empire with these, terrible sort of tyrannies that you discussed. So what changed? I mean, notwithstanding the history that you talked about, it seems like something changed. What was that? What's the distinction?
It changed in regards to.
Well, it seems like something. It seems like notwithstanding the historical sort of similarities that you discussed in to today's modern sort of contemporary crystallization of this stifling structure, ulema being totally captured by the state and so on. It seems like there's something that is different today,
Oh,
you know,
I see what you're saying.
yeah, even notwithstanding the history that you discussed and the
Right.
limitations, but yet there's still some dynamism that doesn't exist now.
Well, you know, in the legal realm, in the realm of the Sharia, there was incredible dynamism, incredible intellectual progress, incredible activity, because they were part and parcel of, they were part of the recipients of the attention because of the need of the political class to assert authority over orthodoxy and what was and to get the justification and the approval of the community and the people. So the scholarly class was not all paid for by the government, but the institutions that produced them were sponsored and were part of the patronage, just like the military class was. So, for example, you know, whether it's in Egypt or Syria or Jordan or in the Ottoman Empire, if you're North Africa, you know, the major madrasas were, you know, had major scholars. I mean, just think of Ghazali, for example, right? In the Nizamiyya, the Nizamiyya was a system of colleges across Central Asia. Its corresponding sister institution was the Hanafiyas, right, as well, which is a corresponding system of educational institutions. Same thing in Egypt as well with Azhar, right, which Azhar originated in the Fatimid era, actually, as a Shia institution, and then after Salah ad-Din, it still had its affiliations. So major institutions required major support and major funding. Now the Awqaf were they flourished during the time of the Mamluks and the Ottomans. Yes, the Awqaf flourished during this time period, and there were many different kinds of Awqaf. This is another area of communal and social flourishing, where people invested in charity as a means of investing in their afterlife, right? Now, Awqaf were fundamental in developing conscious citizenry, if you will, that was interested in the well-being of their fellow neighbors and their fellow community members. Now you ask what changed. Well, I think the question is all the question before that didn't change. What did not change was the focus on prioritizing military needs over intellectual needs and over economic needs, and that is what didn't change even till today. If you look at you know, in the modern era and the birth of modern nation states in the Muslim world, many secularist leaders were former military officers, right, who acquiesced to socialist or fascist ideals. And you think of Turkey, for example, right, the birth of modern Turkey with Ataturk. Think of Iran, for example, at this time period. At the birth of the nation state, or the modern state now, of Egypt, of Iraq, of Syria, Tunisia, and Algeria. Think of Indonesia, for example, Pakistan, another example, right? All of these states were for secularist leaders who had a military background, right? The prioritization of the military, that did not change. But with that, the idea that to come into modernity, to develop a modern state, required authoritarian ideas, right? Hierarchical authoritarian ideas, state control over the economy, state control over the education, state control over society, and the use of Islam as a label to legitimize a regime. That playbook is the same as before. That doesn't make political leaders anti-Islamic. That just makes them political. It makes them invested in the military strategy. So that didn't change. What did change is the fact that, number one, you had in the modern era today, you have a better educated populace that, number one, is in different parts of the Muslim world, more concerned about social well-being and education and the economy. And number two, through the Arab Spring, which in some cases was successful, many cases failed, and in other cases still a work in progress. The idea of a revolutionized, a different state is still a work in progress. Now, so what changed is the fact that rather than focused on a purely legal approach to thinking about the state and governance, now Muslim populace and Muslim communities are thinking more holistically about this as well. No longer is a discussion purely about should the Constitution, be 100% Sharia compliant or fully Sharia. Now people are thinking about education. They're thinking about healthcare. They're thinking about status in society. They're thinking about human rights. They're thinking about an array of issues that animate their lives. There's more of a desire in my experience now, in my conversations with folks and readings and discussions now, to think more deeply about the way the Prophet did things as it relates to governance. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, peace be upon him, because the first state in Islamic history was Medina. If you think about it, the first state, the first governance was Medina, and the Prophet instituted, peace and blessings be upon him, a charter or a constitution where there were equal rights given to members of the society of the state, where there was an agreement about how laws would be adhered to. There was a recognition of rights and equal rights to persons there. There was a final authority. There was a notion of borders. People were given a right to exercise protection to folks who asked for protection. The Prophet was concerned. Also, one of his first acts as the leader of Medina, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, was an act to protect the public health, where he drained the swamp that was collecting mosquitoes, which was a contributing factor to disease in Medina. So a concern for public health. He put a physician, a well-known physician who was a woman, in charge of the marketplace. After all, her name was Shifa, the healer. And so the idea of public health, the concern for public health, public well-being, all of these things are part and parcel now of renewed discussions about what a state is, as opposed to just a legal discussion about what a state is, right? I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm talking about what changed. Change. Legal discussion to a more sociological discussion about what a state is. That's what's different today, and that has happened through calls for revolutions, through calls for economic change, all kinds of calls, right? In pre-modern Islam, that you only had a legalistic perspective of the state, a shariah, sort of fiqhi, juridical discussion of the state. And so as the state bureaucracy grew, the legal system grew. One of the things I used to tell my students who would study Islamic law with me in the past was that there's a big difference in studying the Islamic law of the Shafi school, for example, the Shafi legal school, versus studying the fiqh, the Islamic law of the Hanafi legal school, right? So I was trained in the Shafi school in Yemen and in the Hanafi school in Istanbul. And I said the biggest difference, but just within those two schools, the biggest difference is not how to pray and how to fast. These differences in interpretation. The biggest difference you see amongst these two schools is the way matters are thought about, because to study the Hanafi school is to study an imperial school. Law becomes bureaucratic. Now all of a sudden you have to think about the application of things in different regions and new populations with ever-changing economy, all kinds of things. In a Shafi school that never had the luxury of being applied in an imperial sense, thinking is there, intellectual dynamism is there, but it looks different. But the common approach is that it's all legal, right? You don't have public health discussions there. You don't have other aspects of sociological discussions that are there. That's not a defect in the law. neither is is it a defect in the legal thinking. It's evidentiary of the fact that the law was tied to the growth and the development of the state itself in the political class, right? And also tied to the military, as opposed to being tied to a larger set of social, what we would call today sociological development, societal development. So that's what's changing today in our discussions and development of the state.
Professor Khalil, if I may jump in, in your fascinating scholarly article on the role of waqf and history of this Islamic central feature of Islamic history and civilization, you seem to be saying that the Islamic civilization basically would not have been possible without the role of waqf. So you're talking about different phases of the waqf, and in the end, your conclusion is that you're calling for a revival of the waqf system. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on this? Because I don't think that everyone's read your piece on waqf, and I think it's really important. So if you could just elaborate more on that for us.
Yes, thank you. I believe that the waqf system is one of the finest civilizational legacies of Islam and the Islamic tradition. I think there are other beautiful aspects of the civilizational legacy of Islam. One is the legal aspect, but I believe the waqf is the finest production. Number one, the best historical evidence of such beauty is the Ottoman legacy, the waqf in the Ottoman era. But it is not the only one. In the Mamluk era as well, and in the Safavid era as well. I didn't write very much about the Safavid era because, but what I was trying to do in the article is present the growth and the development and the maturity of a true aspect of Muslim society that, number one, flourished beyond geographical borders in profoundly creative ways, which was evident and is evident of Muslim creativity as it relates to something as humanly common as charity, right? So thinking about the diversity in charity is profound, number one. Number two, it's one thing to be charitable by giving to the poor. It's another thing to establish institutions based on charity that became the bedrock of Islamic educational systems, i.e. the madrasas, became the bedrock in many ways that supported a marginalized but nonetheless active merchant class. It was the sole factor which, from a non-ritual worship, from a non-ibadat point of view, from a non-worship point of view, was an equalizing component between the ruling class and the ruled class, between the palace and the populace. In other words, members of the palace could establish a waqf, and members of the populace could also equally establish a waqf, and they were both given the same legal weight. So a waqf established by a farmer had the same legal credence and legal weight as an endowment or a waqf established by the sultan or the sultan's wife or daughter. They were both looked at equal. And awqafs and waqfs that were established by Christians under Muslim rule and Jews under Muslim rule had the same legal authority as endowments and waqfs that were established by Muslims under Muslim rule. And so as an institution, one more thing, and it's the only institution that was not only completely an equalizing, not geographical, and not only authored and produced by men and women and children and a ruling elite, but it was also the first institution that was targeted by colonial powers for destruction. First institution that we are still to from a collective, as a collective Muslim society. I think it is a most powerful institution. There's a really beautiful example of this about a young man, a young boy who was in the streets of and he was carrying porcelain plates to take home, and he drops the plates and breaks them, and he's sitting on the side of the road in Damascus crying. And Ibn Battuta, who's there traveling at this time, observes this, notices this boy, and he notices a person in the street who stops. Ibn Battuta writes about this. He stops. The person stops and asks the young boy, why is he crying? And the boy points to the broken plates that he was supposed to take back. And now the person who he was going to give the plates to is going to be very upset and might beat him as a result. The person, feeling compassion for this strange child who's just broken porcelain plates, tells the child to pick up the pieces, the broken pieces, go down the street and turn this corner and go to this place and present this place with the broken pieces. The boy does that, and Ibn Battuta follows the young man. He follows him to see what's going on, and when the boy reaches the place, he goes to the window, to the door. The caretaker opens the door. The boy presents the plates. The caretaker plates inside, asks the boy to wait. Ibn Battuta writes about this. And the caretaker comes out with a brand new set of porcelain plates, gives it to the boy, asks him to go for free. Ibn Battuta from the door and says, "What's going on?" He said, "This is a waqf whose sole purpose it is to provide new porcelain dishes to different houses when they're broken, so that young servants will not get beaten and will not get harmed on the way." The servants were transporting dishes, and they knew the hazards of transport. Dishes might get broken. And so there was an endowment established because somebody cared about not the dishes, but cared about the young children and the servants that were being, and established it out of that care. It's a testament to the fact, to the hearts of of society, and particularly Muslim societies, that were concerned about the well-being of people they didn't know about, and cared enough to establish long-term institutions that were funded for the well-being of not only themselves in the afterlife, but they tied their well-being in the afterlife to the well-being of another in the worldly life. That is a unique institution. Although you have charitable foundations and charitable institutions all over history, you have examples of charitable endowments in Christianity, no doubt. In the history of Judaism, no doubt. Even in Far Eastern cultures and Buddhism, Buddhist civilizations, Hindu civilizations, without a doubt. Even in the Zoroastrian tradition, charitable endowments do exist. But what you don't find is the breadth, the degree, the diversity, and the equality and the longevity of such institutions, and the diversity in their approach. So much so that we know that the overwhelming majority of geographical real estate, and we know how valuable real estate is, was to be for the purpose of charitable endowments. So an incredible, on the one hand, people talk about the fact that the Muslim civilization could have developed, they developed the foundations for a strong market economy. The Prophet ﷺ was a successful merchant. Many of his companions were successful merchants. The principles of Islam are very compatible to what we see today in terms of free market capitalism. The idea that there's no limit in terms of a profit that you can make. You can buy and sell. There's prohibitions against riba, but Islamic contract law is very sophisticated. etc. And the ideas of the modern corporation are directly taken directly from the system of waqf. And so there's a very interesting dynamic where the Western European world, through Italy, when they and the Genovian sailors and merchants, when they encountered Muslims, what they took from the Awqaf system was was a way to develop what we call today the modern corporation and the modern university, right? What the Muslims took from it was not the modern corporation, but was a system of charity, right? So what's very interesting, Western capitalism was born from the Genevan encounters with Awqafs in Egypt, right? We know this as a historical fact. There are books written about it, right? And the university, modern university, took the same Awqaf system, but they just turned it into, they copied the madrasa system, became the university, but more importantly, the corporation was developed based upon the exact same model. But instead of corporation and corporate endeavors, the Muslim civilization continued in the mode of charity. And it stored up all of this wealth and distributed it internally amongst marginalized communities and families, rather than becoming a vehicle for investing in the pockets of investors. It went in a different direction. It stored up wealth, allowed wealth to be distributed amongst the Muslim community in profound ways, so that systemic poverty was not, to the best of what we can tell historically, was not a major factor in the Muslim civilization. That does not mean that there weren't poor people, but the systemic poverty we see in today's, in many cases of Muslim states today, was not the norm in the time that you had Awqafs, because of the existence of Awqafs. People had the ability to have their basic needs met, did not have a reliance on the state, and this had a profound effect. So I think it's a fascinating and one of the most beautiful aspects enduring of this Muslim society that we have yet to revive fully today, and that we should think deeply about ways to do that.
Yeah, well, I want to perhaps pick up on some of that, and in this you pointed to the dynamism, the equality, even the dignity that was at the impulse, or that was at the heart of the waqf system, and then some of the legacy of what's been lost as that's been decreased and replaced in many ways with an expansive state that provides services, provides education. And yet if we jump to the present and look at the streets of Baghdad or Beirut or even Algiers, and these large-scale protest movements that are reflective of a failure of the state to deliver on these promises of employment opportunities, education, and these kind of what seems to be a breakdown from between the elites and the burgeoning youth movement. Where would you begin in seeking to revive some of these principles in the contemporary world? There's certainly charity movements. Something I've looked at in particular in Iraq is the way that religious-based organizations have responded to the humanitarian crises, that they're not that they're active participants in meeting these needs of internally displaced or refugee communities. And so there's something there, but where would you point to as we look at the contemporary Middle East in particular, for taking steps to revive some of these institutions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Jeremy, I think, the Muslim world is at different stages now, but I think collectively, there's still the 20th century, let's put it like that. The 20th century has been a very traumatic century for the world, given all the wars, the economic devastation, but definitely so for the Muslim world. And so the Muslim world is dealing with a century of war. Also, at the intersection of modern change. Internal discussions about what change could and should look like. I think one of the things that's necessary is we have been conditioned. When I say we, I mean, the Muslim world. And I don't make any judgments about whether these things are good or bad. I'm just I'm positing a claim here that we have been conditioned towards authoritarianism, right? I mean, conditioned meaning by the patterns of history. And so much of the Muslim world is ruled, it suffers from authoritarianism. And that authoritarianism has roots in a background of the military, prioritization of the military, while at the state control over resources and the absence of a diversification of resources, right? So we have not, wealth has not been diversified enough. In some countries, you have giveaways, gives away wealth to its citizens. But when you have a lot of giveaways and you don't give back in various ways, is a citizen that is paid to love their government, but really does not have an allegiance to it, or suffers from a limited allegiance to it. And so this goes back to Halak's question, right? The original question, why Halak question, Jeremy, right? The state as an apparatus wants the individual to it, it demands it. You think in the American context where there's a pledge of allegiance to the flag, for example, right? I mean, I went to public school. This was something we did every single day. The state, as Halak, physical structures that remind you of its allegiance to it. So if you think about in the American context, for example, Statue of Liberty, for example, right? There's a symbol there. It has various symbols that have meaning, that galvanize the public to support the state, right? Independence Days, etc. The Muslim world has copied and pasted that model to a certain extent. But as a population, Islam as a tradition seeks to take allegiance and reorient it in a different direction. So if it, certainly allegiance to a concrete thing is problematic in an Islamic view. That's a form of idolatry. Allegiance to an abstract entity is to be solely devoted. And therefore, as Halak mentions, Islam is incompatible, according to Halak, with the state because Islam teaches the person to develop an allegiance and therefore independent of the state, independent of any kind of force or mechanism that seeks any type of means of coercion, to force coercion. That is antithetical to Islam, right? Halak has a point in the sense that Islam on its own terms is antithetical to external means of coercion. It teaches a person to grow up and be themselves and do for themselves and to put on their own brakes if they to speak up about it. You don't have to wait for somebody else to speak up about it. If you know something's wrong, you shouldn't do it yourself. If you know something's right, you should do it yourself. So in that sense, what's right and what's wrong, independent of anything else, as an extension of one's allegiance to the divine, to God. On the other hand, the state wants you to conform, right? The state wants you to conform, and if you don't conform, then there's penalties, there's sanctions, etc. And the state has external means of coercion. So they have police apparatus, they have military apparatus, they have secret police apparatuses, surveillance apparatuses, fines for not conforming, jail time, etc. They have different kinds of apparatuses to make sure that one conforms. And one of the interesting things is that the moment that Islam as a belief system becomes co-opted by the state is the very moment that Islam itself becomes authoritarian and violent. And we see this with cases where there are cases or states of Muslim quasi-religious figures, right, or pseudo-scholars who come into state and political positions. And we see the most extreme case in the cases of ISIS, for example, that justified their atrocities in religious, acclaimed religious rhetoric. But nonetheless, authoritarianism is a problem that needs to be fixed. And the root of authoritarianism, the problem of authoritarianism, the root of it is this hierarchical system and the state monopoly of economic resources, which then produces a citizenry that doesn't have to become educated so much, doesn't have to develop so many skills, doesn't have to become entrepreneurially creative. Business class is not needed. One just has to conform. That model today is being is slowly becoming irrelevant. So what needs to happen, I think, one, is there needs to be a rise in commercial and economic activity, which independent of state control. There must be the rise of a business class, an economic interest that emerge where financial resources are not fully in control of the state. Two, the use of those financial resources should be channeled into better development of not only the economy in Muslim countries, but also in the well-being of the Muslim community themselves and where they live. And this occurs through awqafs, through waqfs. So if you want to revive awqafs, you really have to revive entrepreneurial activity and creative business. You have to create an intellectual, diverse business class of men and women in the society, where economic activity begins to be independent, or let me say entrepreneurial economic activity becomes independent of state economic activity. We're not talking about the elimination of state economic activity. We're talking about there needs to be a rise in other players. Where are the Googles in the Muslim world? Where are the Apples in the Muslim world? Where are the Microsoft in the Muslim world? And I'm not saying exact equivalents, but I'm talking about creative intellect. Where are the industrial leaders in the Muslim outside of oil, right? Outside of weapons? Where are they? There's not enough research and development, but you can't even talk about research and development unless you talk about education. You can't talk about education unless you talk about independent economic well-being. Remember, the Prophet's model was the mosque and the marketplace. It was not just the mosque, right? It was the marketplace too. And the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, laid down the rules of the marketplace and then put it in the hands of a woman. Don't forget that. That's a historical fact. He said no interest, right? He banned interest, basic rules of contract, and he also said two things. There was a desire to limit prices in the marketplace. And many of the business leaders came to the Prophet and said, we need to fix prices. And the Prophet said, the ultimate price fixer is God. I will not limit prices, right? So the Prophet, it was, in that sense, it was a free marketplace. People could, they suffered the loss and the benefits of the market in that sense, right? So they could not engage in usury and interest, but they were subject to the forces of the market, which allowed for creativity and development. And it worked so well in Medina that in the Khilafah, in the time of the Khilafah of Omar, we know Omar put a woman in charge of the marketplace in Mecca. That's a historical fact as well. I think her name was Sumaira. I forgot her name, but that's a historical fact. He put a woman in charge of Omar did of the marketplace in Mecca because of the success of the marketplace in Medina. And we know Mecca was a stronger commercial center than Medina was. Medina was an agricultural center, but it became a commercial center through the minds of a brilliant woman who was a physician, but also very skilled in her skill was literacy, right? Shifa. So she could read contracts, right? And so she learned from the Prophet about what was lawful, what was not. He put her in charge, and then Omar did the same thing in Mecca in his Khilafah. So there was a cultivation of the market, of an independent entrepreneurial activity that we've lost, that we must regain. Once that's regained, then people can invest in their own neighborhoods, invest in their own community through waqf. They don't need to rely on government subsidies or government handouts or bailouts and bribes, etc. All of these things. And then when you have a citizenry that can invest in their education, in their communities, economic activity starts to rise, then you have a citizenry that can engage in their governments differently and can think differently about that, because they'll also have a financial stake in the success of their country in a way that's different than the stakes they have now. So I believe that we need more independence economically. And I'm not an economist, but I'll be the first one to say that. But there is no way you can deny the power of the historical precedents of the market, the cultivation of the market by the Prophet, who was a merchant first before he was a prophet, and how that piece has been severely neglected in today's time, and how it is central to the reviving of waqfs and the endowment and the care and the well-being that we can take, Muslims can take in their own communities. We have too many cases where Muslim countries, Muslim populace are too dependent on the governments. Look at Lebanon, right? Look at Lebanon. And that is not a fault of the people, but it is. But now we have to. Our crisis demand new outcomes, new thinking.
Okay, Philip, thank you so much. That was a very, very profound explanation of the system and implications. I have a follow-up, and my question will be the last one, so that we don't demand too much of your time. But and I'm thinking out loud here. I'm thinking as we go, because you've sparked a lot of thinking. So we've heard through our webinars that we've done, and also in some readings, that the state itself, the modern state itself, necessarily subverts religion to be a component of the nation, rather than some transcendent principle around which government and life and everything else is ordered. So I wonder if is there not something, first of all, conceptually incompatible with the contemporary state, in that, so for example, we look at Pakistan, we look at Egypt, two very different countries, but both of them say Islam is the official religion. But I've heard the objection that this itself presumes that the state has the power to say what is the official religion versus what is not. You know, in other words, if they could, if they wanted to, they could change the constitution tomorrow, and they would no longer be the official religion, whatever that means. And so that's an example or an illustration of how the state actually subverts it, just like with the Turkification of the Ottoman Empire of this, you know, where Islam becomes a component of what it means to be a Turk, and with the Turk being the dominant ideology. Now, or the dominant identity. Now, I wanted to also ask about how that the state as the sort of most important thing in our lives compared to God, compared to Allah, you know, how that in practical purposes might impede the type of revival that we're discussing, or renewal. So, for example, in the Arab Spring, which you referred to, I mean, it seems that people are looking to government for this type of solutions that you're talking about. You know, so people aren't sitting around thinking, how can we revive the Islamic civilization? How can we create this sort of economy that you're discussing, independent of the state? They're looking to the state for these sort of solutions. You have, for example, I'm not going to put you in the position of commenting on various Islamic movements and so on, but I raised this. You have the Ikhwan al-Muslimin and the Muslim Brotherhood, who their thinking and their practice has been to capture the state as the means of implementing reform. Same thing in Iran. We saw the same thing in Iran, you know, from a Shiite perspective. So, the question boils down to this: number one, is there something inherently, conceptually, about the modern state that we need to move beyond in order to effectuate the type of revival that we're talking about? And second of all, aside from conceptually, I mean, we just have this sort of framework, or this sort of dependence, where we're the apron strings of the state. You know, so it's almost like impossible. By the way, I was spoken to a group of imams from the Middle East and North Africa, giving them advice on how they could sort of implement a more free religious religion state type of relationship with their countries. And I said, you've got to get away from this notion of ulema being employees of the state, and they can't be with blank stares, because every single one of them were employees of the state. You know, so how do we get beyond this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't profess to, you know, to have the sole solution to that, but what I may offer is maybe some food for us to chew on and debate and talk about, and even and to reform. But I think number one, go back to if you think about, you know, Islam does not, as in the Quran specifically, has in it principles of governance. The Quran is silent about which form of governance, right? So one could not say, you know, one particular form is totally Islamic and another particular form is less Islamic, or what. Governance is the key, and then some certain principles. So I think number one, and number two, the Prophet's point was, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, was about rights and responsibilities, right? Rights and responsibilities. Now, and Islamic history is full of cases where Muslims, well, first of all, you know, from a historical point of view and a pre-modern point of view, Muslims have always lived with non-Muslims. And so we've always had diverse populations, and Muslims have lived under non-Muslim rule for a very long time. And if you think of most recently, you know, under the British Empire, for example, right? And non-Muslims have lived under Muslim rule. Today, however, we have states that lack. I'm talking about in the Muslim realm. We incredibly lack in diversity. We've lost, and that contributes to a loss of tolerance and a type of ignorance as well. It can have that effect, even towards other Muslims, right? And so one of the things that we have to think about is to what extent has living in a nation state that has unified folks along a particular racial or ethnic and linguistic line deprived us of our ability to think broadly and diversely, right? Because the beauty of diversity is that it opens you up to different modes of thinking. If you lack that, that encounter, that diversity long term, you don't live with different people. It lessens your exposure to broad ranges of thinking. You get exposed to thought, but that thought tends to be reproductive of the same kinds of thought patterns that have been placed in the community. So, to a certain extent, it requires thinking out of the proverbial box, which is why I like to see that we in the Hajj and Umrah we go around the Kaaba is a box. We go around the box. We don't go inside the box. To remind Muslims we need to be thinkers outside the box. And so whether or not let's take for example, you have a constitution that says this is an Islamic government. Well, how Islamic is it when the first people you attack are women? How Islamic is it when the first thing you do is authorize human rights abuses and etc. And you don't pride literacy? Where's one of the strongest criticisms in the Quran is infanticide. What are your infant mortality rates? If this is an Islamic country, don't talk to me about the Sharia when your infant mortality rates are extremely high. When the first people you kill are the most vulnerable members of your society, when your literacy rates are low, when people don't, when half of your population is zakat recipients, right, as opposed to zakat payers, and when the first thing you're budgeted for is weapons as opposed to the expansion of health services, etc. Right? Putting Islam in a constitution doesn't get you there. And so what we tend to suffer from, and as a result of authoritarian rule, is that labels do the work for us, right? If the label is there, that makes us who we are. And if it's not there, then somehow we've been stripped of our essence. When that's not the case at all. I think what we need now, furthermore, we suffer from a desire, we suffer from the old habit of linking our ulema with the state, right? Scholars with the state. And there should be a clear independence in this regard. Because if that's not the case, then undoubtedly religion can be corrupted by the tendency of the state to be corrupting. And no human being, no matter how pious and righteous, no human being can claim total freedom from all forces of corruption. So we know that historically, in the time of the old imams of the madhabs, for example, there was a strict separation between the law and the state, between the scholars and the state. That occurred. That changed later, and it gradually grew over time, the allegiance. But in the very beginning, there was strict separation. Scholars were not scholars for dollars, like we see today, too many times. And therefore, the reclaiming of the scholarly voice and the legitimacy of the scholarly voice is very important for the Muslim identity. That has to be part of it. If anything in the Constitution, there should be a separation between the scholarly voices of Islam and the voices of Islam. So one thing that is lacking is the separation of powers, the balance of powers in Muslim statecraft. So whereas in the Islamic tradition, the balance of powers and the separation of powers is intrinsically part of the teachings, but in practice, it tends to be a work in progress. Simple case is shura, right? وَشَاوِرْهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ, the Quran says that the standard of fare should be mutual consultation, right? وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, consult with the people regarding your decisions, because the decisions have effect on them. Mutual consultation means you have separation of powers. right? Why would you mutually consult with somebody and you're an authority over them? There's no need to, right? It means they have a say in the game. That means they have a say in the state. That's why you consult. It's the rule for the family as well. Mutual consultation. If if the husband believes his wife has no say in the household, why would he consult? Right? He just do everything. Right? So the Quranic imperative of mutual consultation means there's a sharing of powers, means there's a balance of powers, and that is lacking in the idea. So going back to Halak's issue, going back to your question, the question is, how do you define Islam? If a definition of Islam is based on the old authoritarian model that has been imported into parts of Islamic history, then when you say Islam, that this constitution is an Islamic constitution, what you're saying is authoritarianism. Welcome the army, right? Here comes the army. Here come the external forces of of coercion, right? When the Quran clearly says la ikraha fi din, there's not supposed to be any coercion in matters of religion. So if the Quran says in matters of religion you can't coerce people, how can you have a religious state? How? When the state is birthed through coercion, right? I mean, one of the beautiful claims is that the state in modern times is birthed in violence. It is. All states are born via a violent activity. Think revolution in the American sense, right? Or the French sense, right? Or even in any sense. Look at Syria today, right? So it's birth. Violence is there. Violence is coercive. So if the Quran says la ikraha fi din in chapter 2, no compulsion in religion, can you have a religious state? And the answer is no. Right? Not in that sense, absolutely not. Religion cannot be a part of state. In that sense, separation between the state and the church is very Islamic. Now, separation between the church and state does not mean that the church, and I say church here because that's the way, that's the way it's on the separation between church and state. But let's say separation between mosque and state does not mean that people don't have rights. Right? The Ottoman millet system is a clear example of religious minorities who had their own legal systems, had their own judges, and could exercise their own laws within that system. And then you had parallel to that diversity, siyasat, the ruler's law. So you can have a constitutional system that separates the state from the mosque or church, synagogue or temple, right? And this, we're talking Islam here, so from the mosque, you can have that separation. And that separation means that religion should be absent of coercion and coercive mechanisms, which means the citizens who are Muslim should be free to practice their faith and to live as Muslims however they choose, so long as they have not broken any state law, right? So long as they've not done that. So if a woman chooses, for example, to not wear hijab or what have you, you can't call her non-Muslim, for example, right? If she chooses to adopt a particular posture between Islam, there's no coercion. People should be free to do what they want. Yes, there should be a normative system there. Yes, there should be voices that say this is what Islam is, this is what Islam is not. That's where you get into to the field of intellectual debate. You use the tongue, not the sword. Where religion is persuasive, not coercive. Through education, through economics, you build societies and you use systems that are Islamic to demonstrate the viability and the truth of those systems, not torture, right? Not amassing, sending secret police or religious police to go beat people if they don't pray or what have you. If going to the mosque is the right thing to do, so show it. Don't beat people, right? Show it, demonstrate it, build beautiful mosques, have programs that are there that attract people, that are relative to the needs of the youth, discussions, right? These are the kinds of things. So we focus on building the state, but we've forgotten how to build community. And in Islam, community was built first in Medina, then the state. And the two apparatus, the community center, the mosque, and the marketplace. People can't pray all day, they got to live, right? And prayer, as powerful as it is, does not put food on the table, right? And God has not asked us to be people of prayer and to forget the life that we have to live. And he's told us in the Quran to cultivate both. So putting all the power in the state renders religion violent. Okay? So there needs to be space for both, and there needs to be separation of both, so that the state can be checked by religion, and at the same time, religion is free from the shackles and the oppressive, coercive mechanisms of the state. That's my opinion.
Thank you. There's so much rich insight there that I wish we could go another hour, 2 or 3 to unpack that. But thank you so much. Osman, we'll open it to you for a final observation, comment as we bring this conversation to a close.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor and a privilege.
Thank you, Professor Halil. There's so much to absorb. I mean, your original thinking on Islamic, the way we understand Islamic history and civilization, definitely we require more time, and hopefully there will be more opportunities for us to discuss this in a different forum. But this, I hope this will be the beginning. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be involved and participate.
Well, thank you. It was an honor and a privilege. I look forward to further discussions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much, Ismail. Thank you, Jeremy, again, and hope to see you again soon on the continuation of this series. Thank you so much. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Osman, Jeremy, Ismail. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Peace and blessings.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Zainab.
Thanks.